Great. Well, thank you very much, Jakob, and it's great to be with you, and great to be with you, Kelsey. And
Yeah, thank you, Craig.
yeah, so I just thought I'd say a few words by way of introduction, just so that everybody knows a bit more about your background, and then we'll dive into the fascinating topic of understanding self. And if we can all understand that completely by the end of this seminar, then I'll be very happy anyway. Um, so Kelsey Perrykkad, postdoctoral research fellow at M3CS, and investigates the relationship between self and well-being, and an incredibly diverse interdisciplinary background, working in fields of cognitive science, including psychology and neuroscience, philosophy, psychiatry, and education. And you work using both theoretical and empirical methods to answer questions about the relations between mental health and cognitive processes, the nature of the self, and how our brains deal with environmental uncertainty. So you had your PhD conferred in mid-2021, titled the Self in Autism, a Predictive Perspective. And you've also investigated other neurodiverse conditions and mental health conditions as well, which we'll explore as the seminar goes on. But we're really here to understand more about ourselves and looking at it from various perspectives. And you've had a particular interest in recent times about understanding transformative experiences, where our sense of self is transformed, for example, by becoming a parent. And you've certainly got a bit of skin in the game as far as that's concerned, having recently become the mother of twins. So perhaps you can share personal perspectives on this as well as from the research side of things. So welcome, Kelsey.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Craig, for having me.
Yeah. The first thing I'd like to do is just to find out a little bit more about what got you interested in this particular area of research.
It was real serendipity. I was an undergraduate student in cognitive science and philosophy looking for a summer research project. And I reached out to Ross Cunnington at the Queensland Brain Institute, who had a project going with one of his PhD students, Simi Punian, who was looking at sense of agency and how environmental kind of conditions change your sense of agency. So sense of agency is like your feeling of control over things in the world. And so I ended up working on that project, and the kind of interest in the general self and how we feel about ourselves kind of blossomed from there.
Yeah. Is a sense of agency like central, an essential element of a sense of self?
I think so. I think that the self is really, it kind of blooms when you look at it in interaction with the world. So, most people might think of the sense of self as a very egotistical, inward looking kind of project. But the way that I conceive of the sense of self is very interactive with the people around us and the environment around us. And so sense of agency, feeling a sense of control over things in the world, I think really is central to my view of the self.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about understanding self, I mean, are we just understanding what we like or don't like, or what we're good at or what we're not good at? I mean, that's often what we think about. Yeah, I know myself. It's just a bunch of those kinds of things. Is that what it means, or does it really mean something else?
I think the self is a real kind of cluster concept of all sorts of different aspects. So it involves personality traits like you're describing, but also kind of your sense of your own body. We have real privileged access to some information that nobody else on the planet has, what's happening inside me at this point in time, my thoughts, my feelings, my heart rate. All sorts of things that nobody else has access to. And so that kind of informs your sense of self. But yeah, I do think that personality traits and that sort of thing are central to who we are. And what we're here today is to understand who we are.
Yeah. So it would include all of that and our habits and dispositions and so on, but it's not restricted to any one of those kinds of things.
That's right. Yeah, it's all of those things kind of in connection with one another that forms this really rich picture of who we are and what we do in the world that's different to everyone else.
Well, one of the main aspects of emotional intelligence, and one of the reasons why people practice mindfulness and so on is to increase self-awareness. So is that a kind of a possible thing that, like, that feeling what's going on in our own body or being aware of what's going on in our own mind, is that a concept that sort of makes sense from your sort of research perspective, this sort of increasing self-awareness leading to more self-knowledge?
Yeah, definitely. I think self-awareness is really important, but also the things that change how we act in the world that are not like that we're not conscious of. So it is the things that you can reflect on, but also the things that are driving your behaviors, but you might not realize they are. So, for instance, if we can look at an example, I might think, one natural way to describe myself, maybe a favorable way, is, I'm a generous person, I'm an academic, I'm a gardener. And then I can kind of look to the world and my actions and figure out whether those things are true of me, myself. And it might turn out that, I'm doing this webinar on a topic I think I'm an expert in. I write papers on a day-to-day basis. So, yep, tick, I'm an academic. I kind of act in the world in ways that fit my understanding of myself. But it turns out that I'm actually a really terrible gardener. I'm a black thumb. Everything I touch dies. And so the world is kind of telling me that I should probably throw out that self-conception. So I might be wrong about myself, is what I'm saying. And kind of our interactions with the world and how I choose to act. I never water my plants, might like actually tell me something that I can learn about myself. I don't know, I'm not aware of all of the things that are true of myself.
So like people in the environment around us can hold up a mirror to ourselves and it's like, whoa, I didn't know I looked like that.
Yeah, exactly. And you kind
I
of
better
have,
get a haircut. I don't know.
yeah, exactly. And that's it. You've got two choices, right? Like one is I've learned something about myself that I don't like or that doesn't fit with who I thought I was or who I want to be. And you can either change your perception of who you think you are. So, I actually have a horrible haircut or I'm not a gardener. Or you can act differently or change the world so that it fits with your mental expectations of who you are. So you get the haircut, or, I go out and learn how to garden, take some classes, and then I can make the world match my expectations of who I am, or I can change the mental model that I have of who I am to match the evidence I'm getting from the world.
Because it's been like taught for quite a long time in a lot of circles, personality, and people have different views on this, like personality, which I suppose would make up an essential part of self, is pretty fixed. You have your formative years when you're young, but even then, personality traits probably show themselves, but it's pretty fixed. And it sounds like, what would your view be? Is personality itself, you were just saying it is malleable, these things are all changeable? And if so, does that mean that we in a sense can be our own gardener, we can be our own sculptor, as it were?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really central to a lot of my work. And you're right that traditionally we've thought of the self as kind of fixed, permanent. It's the essential part of who you are. It's, really far back, it's the soul. It's like the immovable parts of the core of your being. And that is not how I conceive of the self. But in saying that, you have a lifetime of experience that forms your sense of self. Like you said, you go through childhood and even infancy, you have differences in kind of how people interact with the world in infancy. And those things are really hard to get rid of. So it's not as easy as just like, oh, I want to be a different person. And so suddenly my entire life history gets thrown out the window and I can start from scratch. How easy would therapy be if that was how it worked? But I do think that the self is a lot more malleable than we have traditionally conceived of it to be. And it's subject to the same kinds of cognitive processes that everything else is. We can learn about the self, which I think is interesting.
So if it's malleable, is it most malleable when we're young and it kind of less and less as time goes on? And also if something's quite deeply ingrained over a long period of time, might be malleable, but it really requires a lot more work. They talk about bending bamboo and so on. When it's heated in a certain way, it's malleable, but after that, it gets more sort of set. So, is this happen through the lifespan? Is it sort of alter like that, is becoming malleable but harder to change as time goes on?
Yeah, I mean, from a neuroscience perspective, it's only in the last, 50 years that we've really understood that the brain can change into adulthood. So I think it's a commonly held misconception that once you're in your early 20s, your brain is kind of fixed and nothing can penetrate anymore and it's not changing. But actually, the brain is changing throughout the entire life, and not just in aging, but in the like adult phase of life. Your brain is changing and you're learning all sorts of things. I think, like you said, the depth of experience that you get by the time you're an adult makes some things much more difficult to change. So you might think of the self as kind of consolidating over time. But if you have a big change in circumstances, so this is where kind of the parenthood stuff that I've been working on comes in. If you've got a big change in circumstances, in the expectations society places on you, in what you're doing in your day-to-day life, even moving countries, people say they move countries to find themselves, or they travel to find themselves. I think that that's a really genuine experience of putting yourself in a new environment where you can learn and change and grow, and yourself can change in those experiences.
The kind of sense that self, personality, all these things are fixed, it seems to me to be quite a disempowering thing, and it certainly doesn't accord with my experience when younger, and decided various things that it would be better if I was more flexible in this way and a little less introverted in certain situations, a little bit more ready to step into situations beyond the comfort zone and everything. So, because it seems like an idea that it's fixed is quite a disempowering thing, whereas a sense that it's malleable seems to be a much more empowering kind of idea. Coming back to I suppose, the point you raised earlier about a sense of agency.
Yeah, I think so. I think that thinking that you have the power to change who you are, change yourself, and align it more with the person you'd like to be, is really empowering. But I think that there's also a balance between thinking that yourself is so flexible that you get kind of paralyzed by choice, or that you think yourself as too rigid and then you stop trying to improve yourself. I think there's a real balance there to be had.
Yeah. Now you've recently become the mother of twins, so you've had a pretty big transformative experience in your life. If you're happy to talk about it, what did you observe about how your sense of self changed? And did you have this kind of thing on your shoulder talking to you about how you ought to be and all this sort of thing? Was having all of this research, philosophical kind of knowledge really helpful, or really bugged you like crazy about
It's funny when your research becomes me search that I've been interested in pregnancy and the postpartum period for a number of years from a research perspective now. And then just last year, having had my first kids, so I have twin boys, and going through it myself, I think there was a lot of pressure to self reflect and figure out if what I'd been learning from the objective research was playing out in my own life. But I think in reality, dealing with especially twins, but like feeding on a 3 hourly basis and being all consumed by all of this learning, you don't really have the mental space to do the reflection that I'd need to do in order to compare my research work to my personal experience. So I don't have a good answer from the subjective point of view on that, but it definitely felt like a big change. And I think to my sense of self too. But it's also been interesting how many of the things I have been able to reclaim postpartum, and not lose the things that I thought I might lose.
Mm. Right. So more a sense of expansion, or adding to the sort of the palette, as it were, rather than taking away.
Yeah, it definitely felt like there was reconstruction at work, but maybe not from the ground up.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've done a lot of work with neurodiverse conditions. Perhaps we can just start with the autism spectrum. Is the sense of self the same in that situation, or does it tend to be different, or is it just purely an individual thing, or are there commonalities seen across the board? And it'd be interesting to know something about that, and then the perspective of how does that influence the way of being in the world and the way of interacting, etc.
Yeah, definitely. So, um, if you think of a condition like autism, it's a difference in the cognitive mechanisms. So how the world is perceived, how sensory information is perceived, how then that gets turned into a sense of self, an understanding of other people, interactions with other people, expectations for social situations. And so it seemed obvious to me when I started my PhD that that would also influence the same cognitive processes that are generally applied to the self. And in autism research, most people focus on social interactions because it's one of the key definitional criteria of autism is that there are deficits in social interaction. But the cognitive processes would also influence the sense of self was my thinking. So one of the main projects that I've done in that space is looking at how we interact with the world to gain evidence about our sense of self. And across a couple of studies, I found that people with higher autism traits act earlier when there's uncertainty about their sense of self. So it's like the tolerance for uncertainty is lower, or the threshold at which you want to do something to change your perception of self or change the world in order to make that self mismatch go away is smaller in autism, that you act earlier.
Yeah, it's medicine being my background, and one of the interesting things that's coming up quite often as a topic is the potential to feel comfortable with uncertainty, diagnostic uncertainty, etc. If one can feel comfortable with that, then it makes it easier to navigate through to question not if one's uncomfortable with uncertainty, we try to jump to it's this or it's this so that we can get back on firm ground again. How does that play out for, say, is it the same kind of thing for autism? And how does it sort of play out in practical ways?
Yeah, definitely. So it is related to the intolerance of uncertainty or tolerance of uncertainty in the environment, which a lot of autistic people do have difficulties with adapting to changes and that sort of thing. But I think that you also need a certain level of certainty to act, to do things. If you kind of are so caught up in the fuzziness of the world, that you again are paralyzed by the inability to act, then you won't. So I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a different calibration about what level of uncertainty is that kind of triggering for acting or changing, or but it can affect your sense of agency. So like you feel less in control. Often people will feel less in control when the world is more noisy. Yeah.
Amishi Jha is a US neuroscientist, and she was on one of these seminars in a previous time, and she talks about the acronym VUCA, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, as being a key factor that really degrades our attention. That pretty much all of us, if we're in that kind of environment a lot, will experience kind of our attention, our ability to be present is reduced significantly. Does that bear any relevance here? Is it just a different tolerance for different, in different situations for how we can tolerate that sort of level of VUCA as the acronym goes?
So what was the connection to attention again? Could you explain that?
Well, she used the term it degrades attention. So you
Yeah.
put people in and into a situation that's persistently like that. Most people will find it harder to focus, to be present, to pay attention, and so on. And it seemed that challenge with uncertainty, which we all experience in various ways. Is it just different thresholds, perhaps?
Yeah, and I think it's also about your expectations for uncertainty. So if you expect the world to be more black and white, a little bit of noise is going to be bothersome. A little bit of noise in the signal is what I mean. So a little bit of uncertainty is going to be bothersome. Whereas if you expect the world to be much more fuzzy, and it is, then you don't have to kind of do mental work to correct that. But there's also, too much uncertainty expectation. You have to have it precise enough that you can do stuff.
Yeah. With other conditions that you've been interested in, like mental health issues related to, say, depression, anxiety, in what way is the sense of self affected by those conditions?
The sense of self is one of those interesting transdiagnostic factors that they're identifying. So, across most mental health conditions, there's some alteration to the sense of self. So, there are some conditions that we think of as particularly selfy or self-related. So, borderline personality disorder has self-related disturbances in its definition. Schizophrenia, also, you have like delusions of agency, that sort of thing, which are heavily tied to the self, and perceptions of your own body might change, that sort of thing. And then there are conditions that we might think of as less selfy, or like more indirectly related to the sense of self. So like anxiety, depression, that sort of thing, even autism traditionally. But it turns out some of my research has showed that across all of those conditions, there's a correlation with the sense of self, that it's altered in all of those conditions. And there's some work now being done that's trying to use sense of self as one of those things you can measure across conditions that might tell us something about someone's mental health.
Yeah. One of the areas of research in mindfulness has been the interest in the impact that it has on what's called the default mode network, which seems to be where a lot of the self-referential kind of thinking seems to express itself in that area of the brain. So when we might be feeling a bit down on ourselves for some reason, or a bit anxious, and it's sort of like this internal dialogue of self-criticism and judgment, etc. I think we all kind of know what that feels like, because I think we've all experienced it. So this sort of self-referential mental activity, is that an important part of our sense of self? And well, perhaps we'll explore that first, because I'm interested then in what's the potential for meditative, contemplative practices that seem to help to quieten that area of the brain down.
Yeah, so I think there are two things I'd want to touch on there. I think the default mode network is often used in neuroscience research as a self process, that it's like a network in the brain that represents the self in some way. But methodologically, it's kind of questionable to me. So the default mode network is usually measured when you ask people to lie in an MRI scanner, and you just record their brain activity over a period where they're mostly mind wandering or doing a non-specific task. And then you compare that with, a task often. And people will say, okay, so the stuff that was happening when you weren't thinking about anything in particular is default mode network activity, and that's selfie. And I think people do that because when you're left to your own devices, you often think about your own life, or you might reflect on what you've been doing today, or how you're feeling, or you ruminate on whether you're really a good person, or all of those sorts of things. But also you could be planning what you're going to have for dinner. It's kind of a range of mental activity that I think is not necessarily self-specific, but it is commonly in the literature referred to as a self network. I think you get much more specific findings neurally when you look at self conditions compared to, thinking about a friend or a famous person, and those are the kind of contrasts rather than the free-form mind wandering kind of conditions. So that's one thing I wanted to say. But the other is, you were asking about whether mental activity is important for our sense of self, or that self-reflection is that important for ourselves. And I think that it is. So one thing that self-reflection does, and thinking about who we are and what we've done and all of that sort of mental activity, is that's refining your self model. You're spending some time there to set up new expectations for how you're going to act in the world, and then setting yourself up to get new information from the world, evidence from the world about whether those things are true. And so I think it is a central kind of cognitive activity related to the sense of self.
So, could you comment about, people talk about one of the therapeutic benefits of mindfulness is it quietens down that default mode network. Um, uh, I suppose the sense is it leaves a person less burdened by really negative, repetitive, self-critical sort of thought patterns. The person's a bit freer then to navigate through their life and the world with less of that. And indeed, I believe one of the main effects of psychedelics has been to quieten down that area of the brain, and people often describe a sense of expansion, a sense of more interconnected self.
Yeah.
I find these areas a little bit mind-boggling and fascinating. Have you got any comments you'd like to offer in relation to them?
It seems obvious to me that kind of rumination and self-criticism are not going to be good for your mental health. And so getting anything that can kind of break you out of that cycle of repetitive negative thoughts about the self is going to be good, whether that's psychedelics or meditation. Whether meditation then focuses you on the things that are happening now, the evidence that is coming into your system right now that you could learn from, rather than your past experiences, which might put you in that kind of too rigid space of the sense of self. And maybe meditation helps you acknowledge some of the fuzziness that is out there, and get you a more accurate, something that's going to be more helpful going forward, in terms of who you think you are.
Yeah. Where does self-esteem come in? Because it's a big thing, sort of demonized at one time, revered at another time, got to puff up the self-esteem, or the self-esteem gets deflated. Where does that fit into our understanding of self?
Yeah, I mean, so self-esteem is it's like a self-reflective but value-laden judgment. So you're reflecting on yourself, who you think you are, and you're saying that's a good person to be. I like what I see when I look in on myself. So there's this kind of affective value-laden element, not just who I actually am descriptively. Um, and I think again, I'm just going to be the U-shaped curved person. The
Inverted
optimal is
U.
sitting somewhere in the middle. If you don't have enough self-esteem, then you don't achieve your full potential. You're not striving, you're not reaching for things that you think you possibly could achieve. You don't persist in the face of difficulties, because you just think you're incapable. That relates a bit to self-efficacy. I don't know if you've heard that term, but that's like whether you think you're capable in a new environment or in doing a particular task. And people who have low self-efficacy don't persist and don't try when things are hard. And so they don't achieve as big an outcome because they haven't persisted. And that was just all to do with who they thought they were and whether they thought they could do it. Yeah, whereas if you have too much self-esteem, then you're going to try and fail a lot and you might piss a lot of people off. So I think that there's a bit of a balance to be had in getting your self-esteem right. It's good to strive for the bigger and the better, and try and improve yourself, do some actions in the world that make the world around you fit with what you want. But also you can go too far the other way, obviously.
Having extremes of very positive, puffed up self-esteem or very negative, self-critical sort of sense of self-esteem, are they both, can we even talk about distortions of the self, like not seeing, things that really do need improvement, just blind to them, or just not see, I've seen it so often, in oneself, but seen it in others, going mindfulness courses and not seeing the strength and the qualities and everything else that everybody else around them can see, but they just don't see it themselves. Are those sort of extremes distortions of one's sense of self?
Um, yeah, no, I definitely think that's possible. That happens all the time. To me, it's like, what do you take from the world as evidence to inform who you think you are? And do you dismiss evidence that other people are clearly seeing repeatedly again and again and again? You know, you are a kind person. You've done this and this and this for that person. You smiled at that person when they walked in. You made, soup for your sick mother. All these actions that you've done, I see as evidence that you are kind. And maybe you're seeing all sorts of other pieces of evidence, maybe things that we don't have access to. You're ruminating on, why did you not hold the door open for that pregnant woman yesterday? And you're taking that as evidence that you're not a kind person, you're really a horrible person. And maybe that's true, and we're all just seeing a different side of you. But I think that it's all about kind of the evidence that you're getting in and what you take seriously in that evidence and what you're going to dismiss and why. And some of that has to do with your history or your cognitive mechanisms underlying everything, or who you're interacting with, who you trust, all of that sort of stuff.
Can the negativity bias, the so-called negativity bias, come into play here?
Yeah, again, I think the self is just one of many things that our cognitive mechanisms play a role in. And so all of the same kinds of generalized mechanisms and biases can then be applied to the self. So not that we've done research on all of those things, but I think in principle, it's just one topic.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to throw a question which I suppose in some ways confounds sense of self and so on. And Buddhists often talk about, and a lot of wisdom traditions talk about no self.
Mm-hmm.
like what's going, because there's still being a person there, doing things, living, interacting in the world, but there's this sort of striving for no self. Like, what does no self mean in that sort of sense? And how does it fit in with your understanding of self? Is it like a parallel universe, or is it just a...
It's probably not a surprise that I don't really understand the no self view. I think that there are lots of different conceptualizations of the self, and some of which you can kind of deflate. So some people will say the self is an illusion, or that there's no self. And I think when you flesh out the details of what that means, some of those are compatible with how I view the self, and some of them are not. So for instance, is there a core central part of your being that never changes? That view of the self, I would say I'd also have a no self view of that kind of self. But I think my view is that there is a self, and it's important to have a sense of self to act in the world and to be mentally healthy.
I guess it all depends on what we call self.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So just one question before, and in a moment, if you're happy to, we'll take questions from our audience today. If you were going to, if somebody was asking you, I would like to improve myself, I'd like to develop in a kind of a way. With your knowledge and experience and research, are there particular things you can point to or suggest about how a person could change themselves for the better? Like what would be practical things a person could do or apply in their lives that would help them to change in the way that they would want to change or develop?
This is a great question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer, or at least not one that's based on solid research. But
you can give us a bad answer if you like.
I think focusing on the kinds of evidence that support the self you want to be, in the hopes that then drives you to act differently. So it's not just enough to kind of take in information from the world and notice things that confirm who you want to be, because that's a little bit self-serving, and if it doesn't change your actions, you're not going to actually truly become a better person. But you could start by trying to take in evidence that it's kind of like a fake it till you make it strategy. Think of the person you want to be, try and find things in your life that support or evidence that that view of yourself, and then start acting in ways that more truly represent that self in the world.
I'm going to make Jakob cringe right now because I'll quote Shakespeare, but assume a virtue if you haven't.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm aligned with Shakespeare. The good company.
Oh, as we all should be. Although I think Jakob would probably disagree. Perseverance would have to be important, to act in a way that might be difficult. Is neuroplasticity, tell us a little bit about, like we do something again, very difficult, but it gets 1% easier each time. Is the brain rewiring itself to configure itself according to how we're behaving?
Yeah, your brain is constantly changing and the connections in your brain are constantly updating based on what you're doing in the world. So the kind of old view of the fixed brain has really been thrown out the window. And again, I think self-efficacy is really important for that perseverance, that you have to feel like you can achieve things in the world before you're even going to try. So I think that can be a difficult point clinically and kind of even with friendships. How do you convince a friend that they are efficacious, that they are capable if they don't feel capable? It really changes your actions following that belief.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in mindsets these days. People talk about fixed mindsets or growth mindsets, and it seems like that mindset that there's much more agency and potential for change and development with a growth mindset if we can foster it.
Yeah, just believing that you can change does a lot of the work.
Yeah, good. Well, I'll invite Jakob to come back on, and I think there's a few questions that have been appearing in the Q&A. So, Jakob, if you're happy to, and Kelsey, if you're happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you very much. And we already have a few questions in the Q&A. If you are sitting with a question about the self you want to ask to Kelsey and Craig, then pop it in there. We'll begin with a question from Felicity, who says, "Hi, Kelsey and Craig. Very interesting. I'm wondering if anyone has done any research into how the sense of self might change in response to a mindfulness-based intervention."
Tricky question. Yes, I believe they have, but I don't have the answers at the top of my head. So I won't give any satisfying answer to that question, unfortunately. I do think mindfulness changes what you're focusing on, what you're paying attention to, the current moment, that sort of thing, which has the great potential to change, to knock you out of a rigid sense of self. So I don't have a good answer based on literature, but yeah, I think it's an important consideration.
If I could just extend that question,
Yeah.
is the ability to stand back and be more observant, but with less attachment, does that sort of give us a little bit more flexibility to move, mindfulness to facilitate more ability
Yeah.
to adapt and to change?
So you might think of attachment to a self as holding it too rigid, and trying to, resist the changes that are coming from new evidence in a new world and a new environment and new actions. And so being able to detach from that a little bit and acknowledge that self can change and is changing, that might help you to then get a more accurate, functional, happy sense of self.
Yeah, the impermanence of it.
Yeah.
Mm.
There's a comment from an anonymous attendee here who says, "I have ADHD and find mindfulness quite impossible to do because my brain doesn't switch off." So it's a nice and complicated question, really, that about the interaction between mindfulness and the self.
Yeah, and particularly that question is ADHD, so autism and ADHD. And I think, again, if you're highly sensitive to the minutia of what's happening in the current moment, maybe focusing on that more in mindfulness is not what's going to help you break out of your usual habits.
That's good. I learned also what the acronym means then, so that's useful. So here's a question from Lucy, who says, "How hard is it actually to measure aspects of the self in research?"
There are so many paradigms out there to possibly measure the self, and they range from really big picture, kind of explicit measures of the sense of self. So asking people literally, like, do you feel like the same person as you were yesterday? All the way down to some of the stuff that I do where you're looking at like mouse movements on a screen, and asking people about whether they feel agency over those mouse movements, or neural signatures, that sort of thing. I think you just have to get really clever about those contrast cases. So if you think back to like, your Science 101 primary school science, and you're thinking about controlling for things, trying to make two cases where the only difference is the thing you're interested in so that you can measure the thing you're interested in. And so it's finding, what's not self that you can contrast with the self case.
Okay, and here's a question from Jessica. Do you think we can hold multiple senses of self at once?
Yes, I think so. I think that happens when you have really big contextual cues. So, for instance, people talk about having a different self at work versus at home. And it might be that you act differently in those different contexts to a drastic degree. And yeah, so I think yes, but I think it's mentally healthy if at some level those things integrate and you're not being totally inconsistent across those contexts. So you as a parent might be a different self to you as a friend or a colleague. But if they're drastically different, that's going to cause conflict psychologically, I would think.
And somewhat related to this, related to the question of where does the sense of self come from? And the question is, to what extent do our genes influence our sense of self? And I guess you could add to this also whether what happens in development from infant to baby to and so on, adolescence.
If I can answer this one from a personal perspective a little bit, less research, I've been really fascinated by my experience being a twin parent. So I have fraternal boys, they're non-identical, so they're genetically different. But coming from psychology and this whole view that, the brain is plastic and that we're constantly learning and sensitive to our environments in these really complex ways, I had this massive bias before I became a parent that most things were super flexible and that it all just was the environment. And then I had this real life experiment of having twins, so two boys with different genetics who were raised in the same household at the same time with me as in some ways, the same parent. I couldn't delude myself into thinking, that I had a baby and then I had a subsequent baby and I'd learned something from the first one, that I was applying different parenting techniques to the second one. And they have just been so different from day dot. And that means I've been a different parent to them because I've responded differently to them. But it wasn't because I've learned something. It was just because they were different to begin with. So I think there is a bigger genetic component than I was willing to admit 5 years ago. But yeah, it's interesting how that happens and how the genetics interact with the environment. Really is a nature-nurture combination.
Well, it kind of brings in that whole sense of our understanding of the brain's different, but it's also understanding of our genetics is different. Because it used to be just what's programmed into your DNA. And now we understand that epigenetics are changing how that DNA expresses itself by interaction with the environment and people and habit and behavior. So it's
and identical twins are also different from day dot according to their parents. So, the epigenetics are different. Your position in the womb is different, which could affect your psychology, even separate from your genetics. So I think, yeah, it is complex.
Okay, somewhat related to this is a question from Dang. Says, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. What do you think are the roles of culture and social norms and expectations from, I guess, yourself and others in your sense of self? And so following on from this, can we equate a sense of self as identity as well?
Yeah, so I would build an identity into the kind of bigger picture of the sense of self. And your identity is highly shaped by your cultural situation and expectations from your culture about who you are and what a good person looks like, and how you should experience the world that you end up living in. So one example that I think is quite interesting I'm just trying to think of how this is, anyway, is baby brain. So people think of, or they expect women postpartum to have a deficit in their cognition, which changes how women experience the postpartum period because they expect themselves to have a deficit in cognition. But a lot of the research has shown mixed results on whether there is an objective difference in cognition. So we expect ourselves to be poorer at doing things in our day-to-day life, but actually we might not be. And so the kind of cultural expectations on women in that period have affected how they're experiencing that time in their lives and how that is influencing their sense of self in that time. So sorry, that was a kind of sidestep to the actual culture question. But basically, yes, the social expectations around you are going to influence how your sense of self is manifest.
We might follow this up with a comment which says, as a clinician working in rehab, how do I support patients with BPD when they need to learn new skills post-amputation? I find it really challenging to engage patients as they have difficulties with self-image and also self-efficacy. So there are changes to various conditions such as amputation, where self-efficacy and self-image begins to change. How should a clinician engage with that?
I think that's a really tricky question. I don't think I have the pay grade. I don't have the skills to answer that question in the actual applications. But I think that it is an important consideration for a clinician working in that with those groups, whether that's amputees or people with BPD, to consider the sense of self and how it's affecting daily life, and to consider how it's affecting the experiences of transformations such as amputation, or their experience in the world with BPD. That they've gotten evidence over and over again about what they're effective in doing and what they're not effective in doing. That might influence how they experience therapy.
Just diving into the neuroscience, Pablo asks, if it's not just the default mode network that's involved, is there any kind of consensus on the neural signatures related to the sense of self?
There's been a bit of research into it. I think the consensus, at least 10 years ago, there was a paper called Is the Self Special, that looked at all sorts of different neural signatures of the sense of self. And their conclusion was basically no, that there are too many different kinds of mechanisms. There's not one brain area that you can knock out and then suddenly you don't have a sense of self. So it's not as simple as some other cognitive processes or neural signatures that we look for, but particular kinds of like sense of agency might have something that's more specific, or your recognition of your own face. There's kind of more specific brain areas that are related to that. And so depending on what aspect of the sense of self you're thinking about, there might be like a brain area or a neural signature that's out there to find.
Okay. I have one last question I think that'll be nice to ask, which instead of asking about the brain bases, asks about essentially metacognition. So the question is this: I'm a Buddhist and I've been practicing for a period of time. I'm constantly in my day-to-day life becoming aware of the knower and doer, and I use this to regulate my mind content that flows into my actions and behavior. Is there any research done on this kind of ability, I guess, to metacognitively step outside of your own self and see it from the outside? Is there any research on that?
Not that I know of, but it is a really interesting question, and what that's useful for is also interesting to explore. Yeah.
Okay.
But no, I don't know of any research.
That's good.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much, Jakob. And I just want to say on behalf of everybody on the call today, thank you very much, Kelsey. It's been fascinating. And we look forward to hearing more about your work, your research in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.